and it is this: not all sensitivity is born from love, and not all empathy comes from a natural openness to life. There exists a form of empathy that is carved, not gifted, an empathy that emerges not from safety but from prolonged exposure to emotional danger. It is the empathy of the survivor, the one who learned to read the atmosphere of a room long before they learned to trust it, the one who developed perception not as a luxury but as a necessity for survival. When you look at such a person, you may be tempted to call them compassionate, intuitive, deeply attuned, and yet beneath this refined sensitivity, there lies an origin that is rarely spoken. Trauma is often the soil from which this kind of awareness grows. If you have ever found yourself feeling everything around you with exhausting clarity, sensing shifts in mood before a word is spoken, noticing tensions others deny, absorbing emotional undercurrents like a silent antenna, then you must ask yourself a difficult question. Did this ability arise because the world welcomed you, or because the world once felt unsafe enough that you had to learn how to anticipate danger before it arrived? You see, the psyche is not naive. It adapts with extraordinary intelligence. When a child grows in an environment where emotional stability is uncertain, where love is conditional, unpredictable, or shadowed by fear, the unconscious begins to sharpen its instruments. It develops what I would call hyperattunement. The child learns to read micro-expressions, tonal changes, subtle gestures, the unspoken tensions that exist beneath words. This is not empathy in its purest form. It is vigilance disguised as empathy. And this distinction is essential because trauma-born empathy carries a hidden burden. It is not simply the ability to feel others. It is the inability to stop feeling them. It does not ask permission before it enters hyperattunement. Survival disguised as sensitivity or awareness snorts. It floods the psyche with information, emotional data that the conscious mind often struggles to process. Over time, this creates a state of chronic psychological saturation. You may recognize this in yourself if you often feel exhausted after social interaction without fully understanding why. It is not the conversation itself that ends you. It is the unconscious labor of continuously scanning the emotional landscape around you. You are not merely listening to words. You are absorbing atmospheres. You are not merely observing people. You are registering their unresolved tensions, their hidden fears, their suppressed conflicts. Now here lies the paradox that most people do not understand about trauma-born empath loners. They do not withdraw from the world because they lack love for humanity. They withdraw because they feel too much of humanity. Their solitude is not indifference, it is protection. There comes a moment in such a person's life when the psyche reaches a threshold. It recognizes that constant emotional exposure is unsustainable. At this point, the individual may begin to withdraw, not consciously at first, but instinctively. Social environments begin to feel overwhelming. Crowds feel suffocating. Even close relationships may begin to feel heavy because they demand continuous emotional engagement. This withdrawal is often misunderstood by others. People may interpret it as coldness, arrogance, or aloofness, but in truth, it is the psyche attempting to restore equilibrium. Music, it is the unconscious, saying you cannot continue to absorb without boundaries, or you will dissolve. You must realize something profound here. Trauma-born empath loners stand at a very delicate psychological intersection. They possess extraordinary perceptive abilities, but they also carry the risk of psychological fragmentation. If they do not learn to regulate this sensitivity without integration, their empathy can become a form of self-erosion. This is why so few truly survive this stage intact. Many either numb themselves, shutting down their perception entirely, or they remain emotional saturation, and why empaths feel exhausted, perpetually overwhelmed, trapped in cycles of emotional exhaustion. Only a small number manage to transform traumatic empathy into something stable and integrated. What determines whether one survives this process is not the presence of empathy itself, but the development of boundaries within the psyche. The individual must learn that perception does not require absorption. To see does not mean to carry. To understand does not mean to merge. Yet this lesson is extraordinarily difficult for trauma-born empaths because their original survival strategy depended precisely on merging with their environment. As children, they could not afford to separate themselves from the emotional field around them. Their safety depended on anticipating others' emotional states. This survival mechanism becomes deeply embedded in the unconscious, and so as adults they often struggle with a profound inner conflict. One part of the psyche continues to seek attunement with others, while another part desperately seeks distance. This creates a tension between connection and withdrawal, a push and pull that defines much of their inner life. You may experience this as a strange contradiction. You long for deep connection, yet when it arrives, snorts, you feel overwhelmed. You crave intimacy, yet prolonged closeness begins to feel suffocating. You wish to help others, yet you feel exhausted by their emotional demands. This is not a flaw in your character. It is the psyche attempting to renegotiate its boundaries after a lifetime of over-attunement. At a deeper symbolic level, trauma-born empath learners often embody a very ancient archetypal pattern, the wounded scar. Music, throughout mythological history, there exist figures who gain extraordinary perception precisely because they have endured suffering. They see more than others, but their vision isolates them. They understand human nature with unusual clarity, yet they often stand at the margins of society. This archetype appears in many cultures because it reflects a universal psychological truth. Heightened awareness often comes at the cost of belonging. To see too clearly is to recognize contradictions that others prefer to ignore. It is to perceive unconscious motives behind social behaviors. It is to feel the emotional dissonance beneath polite interactions. And this clarity can create a sense of profound loneliness. For trauma-born empath loners, this loneliness is not merely social, it is existential. They often feel that they cannot fully share their inner reality with others, the loner paradox. Feeling too much of humanity because their perceptions are too nuanced, too complex, too deeply rooted in subtle psychological dynamics that most people do not consciously perceive. This leads to a form of silent isolation, not because they lack relationships, but because they lack resonance. They may be surrounded by people yet feel unseen at a fundamental level. Here the danger becomes psychological withdrawal. While into excessive solitude, while periods of solitude are necessary for restoration, prolonged isolation can lead to a disconnection from the relational aspects of the psyche. Human beings require some level of interpersonal engagement to maintain psychological balance. Thus, the central challenge for trauma-born empath loners is not to eliminate their sensitivity, but to transform it. They must learn to differentiate between perception and responsibility. They must recognize that understanding another person's emotional state does not obligate them to fix it. This realization marks the beginning of true psychological individuation. Individuation, as you must understand, is not the process of becoming less sensitive. It is the process of becoming more differentiated. It is the ability to remain aware of others without losing oneself within them. For the trauma-born empath, this requires a profound shift in identity. They must move from the unconscious role of emotional guardian, the one who constantly monitors and stabilizes others, into a more autonomous psychological position. This shift often feels frightening because it challenges the original survival pattern that defined their life. Letting go of hyper-attunement can feel like losing a form of protection. The unconscious fears that without constant vigilance, danger will return. But in reality, what the psyche must learn is that adulthood offers new forms of safety that did not exist in childhood: boundaries, choice, autonomy. These are tools that allow the empath to remain perceptive without being consumed. Only when this transformation occurs can trauma-born empathy evolve into something truly powerful. It becomes no longer a survival mechanism, but a form of conscious insight. It allows the individual to understand others deeply without losing themselves. And this is why so few truly survive this stage in a healthy way. It requires not only awareness but courage, the courage to release the threshold. When withdrawal begins survival patterns that once protected the psyche, but now limit its growth. If you find yourself walking this path, you must understand that your solitude is not a sign of failure. It is a stage of psychological restructuring. It is the psyche recalibrating its boundaries after years of overexposure. You are not withdrawing because you are incapable of connection. You are withdrawing because your inner world is undergoing a necessary transformation. And this transformation, though painful, carries within it the potential for something extraordinary. The emergence of a self that can feel deeply without being overwhelmed, that can perceive clearly without becoming isolated, that can engage with humanity without losing its center. When this stage is successfully navigated, trauma-born empath loners do not become detached from the world. They become anchored within themselves. They no longer merge with the emotional chaos around them. They stand within it with clarity. And from this position they possess a rare capacity, the ability to see human nature with both compassion and discernment without illusion, without self-sacrifice, and without losing their own psychological integrity. This is the threshold at which survival transforms into individuation, and very few reach it. Music, when you begin to approach this threshold, the point at which trauma-born empathy must transform or collapse, you often encounter a peculiar psychological experience that feels almost paradoxical. It is as though the variability that once connected you to the world now begins to separate, rate you from it. You start noticing patterns in human behavior that you can no longer ignore. And with this recognition comes a quiet but profound shift in your relationship to others. At first, this shift does not feel like strength. It feels like disillusionment. You may find yourself observing interactions that once seemed ordinary and suddenly sensing the unconscious motives beneath them. The subtle negotiations for approval, the hidden fears driving certain behaviors, the unspoken tensions that structure social dynamics. What once appeared simple now reveals layers of complexity, and this awareness can be deeply unsettling for the trauma-born empath. This stage often arrives gradually. It does not occur as a sudden revelation, but rather as an accumulation of realizations. Small moments in which you recognize that you are no longer able to participate in emotional exchanges in the same way you once did. You may notice that conversations which once felt engaging now feel exhausting. Not because you lack interest, but because you perceive the emotional, the wounded seer archetype explained subtext behind them. You sense what is not being said. You detect the discrepancies between with, ords, and inner states. You feel the tension between the persona a person presents and the reality they unconsciously carry. This heightened perception introduces a profound psychological dilemma. You cannot unknow what you now see. And this is where the archetypal pattern of the seer becomes particularly relevant. In ancient mythology, the seer is often portrayed as both gifted and burdened. They possess vision, yet that vision isolates them. They understand truths that others cannot or will not acknowledge, and this awareness places them at a distance from ordinary experience. The trauma-born empath enters a similar psychological territory. Music. You begin to recognize that much of human interaction operates on unconscious agreements. Agreements to maintain illusions, to avoid confronting certain truths, to preserve social harmony at the cost of authenticity. But once you perceive these unconscious dynamics, participating in them becomes increasingly difficult. This creates what I would call the loneliness of clarity. It is not loneliness in the conventional sense of being physically alone. It is a deeper sense of psychological separation. The feeling that you are witnessing real ID through a lens that others do not share. You may still be surrounded by people yet feel internally distant because your perception operates at a level that is not easily communicated. This stage is particularly dangerous for trauma-born empath loners because it can lead to an unconscious withdrawal not only from social environments but from emotional engagement itself. The psyche, overwhelmed by the constant influx of subtle information, may attempt to protect itself by reducing exposure altogether. You may notice that you begin to avoid certain environments instinctively, not because you consciously choose to isolate yourself, but because your nervous system anticipates the emotional overload that such environments will produce. Crowded spaces, highly charged social gatherings, or relationships marked by unresolved conflict may begin to feel intolerable. At a physiological level, this is not simply a psychological reaction. The body itself participates in this process. The trauma-born empath often carries a nervous system that has been conditioned by prolonged exposure to emotional unpredictability. This conditioning creates a heightened baseline sensitivity and autonomic state T. Hat remains perpetually alert to subtle environmental cues. When this nervous system is exposed to excessive emotional, the loneliness of psychological clarity stimuli, it can enter states of overwhelm or shutdown. You may experience this as sudden exhaustion, mental fog, music, emotional numbness, or an urgent need to withdraw. It is important that you understand this not as weakness, but as an adaptive response. The psyche and the body are attempting to regulate a level of sensory and emotional input that exceeds sustainable limits. However, if this withdrawal continues without conscious integration, it can lead to a more serious psychological risk dissociation from life itself. This is the point at which trauma-borne empathy may transform into emotional detachment. The individual exhausted by years of hyper-attunement may unconsciously numb their perception altogether. They may lose not only their capacity to absorb others' emotions, but also their capacity to feel deeply within themselves. This stage can be deceptive, because it often appears as calmness. Others may interpret this shift as maturity, composure, or emotional strength. They may say that you have become more stable, less reactive, more self-contained. But internally, the experience may feel very different. It may feel like a quiet emptiness, a reduction of emotional vitality, a sense that the world has become muted. This is not true individuation. It is protective disengagement. True individuation does not require the suppression of empathy. It requires the differentiation of empathy from identity. The trauma-borne empath must learn that sensitivity does not need to define the core of their being. They are not their perception. They are not their attunement. They are not their ability to detect emotional nuance. Snorts. These are functions of the psyche, not the essence of the self. At this stage, a crucial transformation must occur. The shift from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy. Unconscious empathy operates automatically. It absorbs without boundaries. It merges with the emotional field around it. It responds instinctively, often without the participation of conscious awareness. Conscious empathy, by contrast, involves choice. It allows you to perceive others without entering their emotional state. Music, it enables you to understand without identifying. It creates a psychological space. Between observation and absorption. This shift is extraordinarily difficult for trauma-borne empath loners because it requires dismantling a survival strategy that once ensured their safety. The nervous system overload and emotional burnout unconscious resists this transformation because it equates hyper-attunement with protection. But what the psyche must learn is that the conditions that once necessitated constant vigilance no longer exist in the same form. As an adult, you possess agency. You can choose your environment. You can establish boundaries. You can withdraw from harmful dynamics. You are no longer dependent on others for survival in the way you once were. The unconscious, however, does not easily update its perceptions of reality. It continues to operate according to patterns established in early life. This is why trauma-borne empath loners often feel trapped between past and present. Their current environment may be safe, yet their internal responses remain shaped by earlier experiences of instability. To move beyond this stage, you must engage in a process of conscious reorientation. You must begin to teach the psyche that perception does not require constant readiness for danger. One of the most powerful ways this occurs is through the development of inner boundaries, not physical boundaries, but psychological ones. These boundaries allow you to maintain awareness of others without allowing their emotional states to penetrate your core identity. You begin to recognize that you can observe someone's pain without carrying it. You can understand someone's fear without internalizing it. You can witness someone's turmoil without becoming destabilized. This realization does not diminish your compassion. Music, it refineses it. Compassion rooted in unconscious merging leads to exhaustion. Compassion grounded in differentiation leads to sustainability. This distinction marks a profound turning point in the life of the trauma-borne empath loner. It is the moment when survival begins to give way to autonomy. Yet this transition is often accompanied by another painful experience. The recognition that many relationships were built upon your unconscious role as emotional regulator. When you stop absorbing, when you stop stabilizing others automatically, when you begin to establish boundaries, some relationships may change dramatically. People who once felt comfortable, our table in your presence may react with confusion, resistance, or even hostility. They may accuse you of becoming distant, selfish, or cold. They may attempt to re-establish the old dynamic in which you served as their emotional anchor. This reaction is not a reflection of your failure. It is a reflection of the unconscious equilibrium that previously existed within those relationships. When the danger of dissociation and emotional numbing element changes, the entire system must reorganize. For the trauma-borne empath, this stage can be profoundly isolating. You may find yourself standing at a psychological distance from people you once felt deeply connected to. You may experience grief not only for lost relationships, but for the loss of a former identity. You are no longer the one who absorbs everything. You are no longer the one who exists primarily in response to others. You are becoming something unfamiliar, an individual whose center lies within themselves. And this transformation, though necessary, often feels like walking through a vast inner wilderness. It is here in this psychological terrain that the next phase of individuation begins, the phase in which trauma-born empathy won. Not merely regulated but integrated into a stable and enduring sense of self. And it is within this integration that the loner ceases to be defined by isolation and begins to embody something far more profound. An inner sovereignty that allows connection without surrender, perception without depletion, and compassion without self-erasure. This is the path that only a very small number fully complete, and it is why, psychologically speaking, so few truly survive this transformation in its highest form. As you move deeper into this transformation, you begin to encounter a psychological territory that is both unsettling and sacred, a space in which the old identity no longer fully holds you, yet the new identity has not completely formed. This is the region the alchemists once called the Negrado, the dark phase of inner dissolution where structures that once provided stability must disintegrate so that something more authentic may emerge. For the trauma-born empath loner, this stage often feels like a quiet collapse of familiar inner landmarks. The roles that once defined your sense of worth begin to lose their power. You may no longer feel compelled to fix, soothe, anticipate, or carry others as you once did. The unconscious contracts that bound you to these roles begin to dissolve, and with this dissolution comes an unfamiliar emptiness. This emptiness can be frightening because it does not resemble the vibrant sensitivity you once knew. It is not the overwhelmed emotional intensity of hyperattunement, nor the numbing detachment of protective shutdown. It is something quieter, from unconscious to conscious empathy, more ambiguous, almost like a pause in the psyche's usual movement. Many individuals mistake this state for loss of identity, loss of connection, loss of meaning. They may ask themselves, often with subtle anxiety, who am I if I am no longer the one who holds everyone together? Who am I if I am no longer defined by my ability to feel everything around me? You must understand that this question marks a profound turning point. It signals that the psyche is shifting from a relational identity, one defined primarily by interaction with others, toward an intrinsic identity rooted in the self. This distinction is crucial. The relational identity depends upon external emotional dynamics for its sense of purpose. It derives meaning from being needed, from being born. Being attuned from being indispensable to the emotional equilibrium of others. The intrinsic identity, however, emerges from a deeper center within the psyche. It is not contingent upon external validation or functional roles. For the trauma-born empath, the movement from relational identity to intrinsic identity often feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory. It requires relinquishing a subtle but powerful psychological attachment, the attachment to being necessary. You see, for many trauma-born empaths, their early life taught them that their value depended upon their ability to stabilize their environment. They learned often unconsciously that their sensitivity was the reason they were tolerated, accepted, or even loved. Their worth became intertwined with their function. As this function begins to dissolve, the unconscious may experience it as a threat to existence itself. The psyche may produce anxiety, restlessness, or a sense of purposelessness, as though something essential is slipping away. But what is actually occurring is not loss. It is reorganization. The psyche is redistributing its energy. The emotional resources once invested in constant external attunement begin to withdraw inward. This withdrawal does not signify disengagement from life. It signifies the redirection of attention toward the inner world. At this stage, many trauma-born empath loners begin to experience an intensified relationship with their own unconscious. Dreams may become more vivid. Symbolic imagery may arise spontaneously, and inner reflections may deepen in complexity. It is as though the psyche, boundaries, seeing without absorbing, no longer occupied with constant external monitoring, begins to reveal its own hidden contents. This encounter with the inner world can be both illuminating and disorienting. For the first time, music, you may begin to notice aspects of yourself that were previously overshadowed by your focus on others. You may discover suppressed anger, long-buried grief, unacknowledged desires, or impulses that contradict the compassionate persona you have long embodied. This is the encounter with the shadow. For trauma-born empaths, the shadow often contains qualities they were never permitted to express. Assertiveness, selfishness, resentment, even hostility, because their early survival depended upon maintaining emotional harmony. These aspects were pushed into the unconscious. They became incompatible with the identity of the empathic stabilizer. But as individuation progresses, the shadow inevitably emerges. It demands recognition, not because it seeks to destroy empathy, but because it seeks balance. True empathy cannot coexist with the complete suppression of one's own needs and emotions. This confrontation with the shadow can feel deeply unsettling. You may find yourself experiencing emotions that seem foreign or unacceptable. You may feel anger toward those you once tirelessly supported. You may recognize patterns of self-sacrifice that now appear unsustainable. It is essential that you do not interpret these revelations as signs of moral failure. They are indicators of psychological integration. The psyche is attempting to restore equilibrium. It is bringing into awareness aspects of your nature that were excluded in order to maintain your former role. These aspects do not negate your empathy. They protect it from becoming self-destructive. In fact, without the integration of the shadow, empathy remains incomplete. It remains vulnerable to exploitation, to exhaustion, to dissolution of identity. When the trauma-born empath begins to integrate the shadow, a profound transformation occurs. Empathy becomes grounded in strength rather than vulnerability. It becomes discerning rather than indiscriminate. It gains the capacity to distinguish between genuine need and manipulative demand. This shift often produces a noticeable change in your relational dynamics. You may find that you no longer respond automatically to others' emotional signals. You may pause before offering support. You may feel a newfound ability to say no without overwhelming guilt to others. Snorts, relationship shifts. When you stop carrying others, this transformation can appear startling. They may perceive you as less accessible, less accommodating, less predictable. Some may attempt to interpret this change negatively because it disrupts the unconscious roles that once structured your relationships. But internally, you may begin to experience something profoundly new, a sense of stability that does not depend upon constant emotional engagement with others. This stability arises from what I would call the emergence of the inner center, music, a psychological point of reference that remains intact regardless of external circumstances. It is the experience of being anchored within yourself. For the trauma-born empath loner, this anchoring represents a decisive shift. You are no longer oriented primarily toward external emotional landscapes. You are oriented toward your own inner axis. From this position, your perception changes in subtle but powerful ways. You may still sense the emotional currents around you, but they no longer penetrate you in the same manner. They are registered as information rather than absorbed as experience. This creates an extraordinary capacity, the ability to witness without merging. You can observe conflict without becoming destabilized by it. You can encounter suffering without losing your equilibrium. You can offer compassion without sacrificing your own psychological integrity. This is the stage at which trauma-born empathy evolves into conscious insight. And yet this transformation brings with it another form of solitude, one that is less painful but equally profound. As your inner center strengthens, you may notice that your resonance with many people diminishes. Music, not because you no longer care, but because your psychological orientation has shifted. You are no longer drawn to that emotional chaos. You are no longer compelled to participate in unconscious relational patterns. This often results in a narrowing of your social world. You may find that only certain individuals feel truly compatible, those who possess a similar level of self-awareness, those who respect psychological boundaries, those who are capable of authentic connection rather than unconscious entanglement. This selective resonance is not a sign of isolation, it is a sign of individuation. The trauma-born empath loner, having traversed the stages of hyperattunement, disillusionment, withdrawal, shadow integration, and inner anchoring, begins to embody a form of presence that shadow integration for trauma-born empaths is both deeply perceptive and quietly sovereign. They are no longer defined by their loneliness, nor by their sensitivity alone. They have become something more complex, an individual whose empathy is rooted in consciousness rather than compulsion. This state is rare, not because it is inaccessible, but because it requires enduring a long and often painful psychological journey, a journey through dissolution, confrontation, music, and reconstruction. It demands that one relinquish the identity of the perpetual caregiver. It demands that one face the shadow without retreat. It demands that one tolerate the solitude of inner transformation without seeking premature escape through external validation. Few are willing to endure this process fully, but those who do emerge not diminished but profoundly transformed, possessing a depth of perception that is no longer a burden, a capacity for connection that no longer threatens their stability, and an inner center, music, that remains unshaken even amidst the turbulence of human experience. And it is from this center that the final stage of this transformation begins to unfold, the stage in which empathy is no longer merely a survival adaptation, nor merely a personal capacity, but becomes an instrument of psychological clarity that can illuminate both oneself and the world without consuming either. This is the threshold that very few reach, and it is here that the trauma-born empath Lona ceases to be defined by survival and begins to embody the full sovereignty of the individuated self. When this final threshold begins to unfold, you may notice that something subtle yet unmistakable has changed in the way you inhabit the world. It is not a dramatic transformation, not an outward spectacle that others immediately recognize. Rather, it is an inner realignment so profound that it quietly alters every interaction, every perception, every movement of your psyche. You no longer experience empathy as something that happens to you. It is no longer an uncontrollable influx of emotional information that floods your awareness. Instead, it becomes something you possess, something you can direct, something that operates under the quiet authority of your conscious will. This distinction marks the completion of a long psychological journey for the trauma-born empath loner. This stage represents the emergence of what we might call psychological sovereignty. You have moved from unconscious, the emergence of inner sovereignty attunement, to conscious perception, from survival-driven vigilance to self-directed awareness, from emotional merging to differentiated presence. And this sovereignty carries a quality that is difficult to describe to those who have not experienced it. It is not detachment in the cold sense. It is not indifference. It is not the absence of feeling. It is a state in which you can remain fully present, essent to the emotional reality of others without losing your own center. This presence is extraordinarily rare because it requires the integration of two psychological capacities that often exist in opposition: deep sensitivity and strong boundaries. Most individuals possess one at the expense of the other. They are either highly empathic but easily overwhelmed, or strongly defended but emotionally disconnected. But the trauma-born empath who has successfully traversed the path of individuation embodies both simultaneously. You can feel without dissolving. You can understand without absorbing. You can care without sacrificing yourself. This balanced state creates a new kind of relational dynamic. Others may sense something unusual in your presence, a calm that is not passive, an attentiveness that does not intrude, a steadiness that does not attempt to control. People may find themselves revealing truths in your presence that they have never spoken aloud. They may feel seen in a way that is neither invasive nor demanding. They may experience a sense of psychological safety simply because your awareness does not impose itself upon them. Music, and yet there is also something unmistakably firm about your presence. You no longer emit the unconscious signals of availability that once invited emotional dependency. There is a clarity in your boundaries that communicates without words that you cannot be unconsciously drawn into another's turmoil. This combination, deep receptivity paired with unwavering self-containment, defines the fully integrated empathic individual. At this stage, the loneliness that once accompanied your sensitivity undergoes a profound transformation. It does not vanish entirely, for individuation always carries an element of solitude, but it changes in quality. It becomes no longer the loneliness of exclusion, but the solitude of inner completeness. You are no longer alone because you cannot be understood. You are alone because you have discovered a relationship with yourself that does not conscious empathy versus emotional merging depend upon constant external resonance. This inner companionship provides a stability that was previously absent. It allows you to engage with others from a place of wholeness rather than need. Connection becomes a choice rather than a necessity for psychological survival. From this position, your relationship with humanity, together as a whole, also shifts. You begin to perceive human behavior with a clarity that includes both compassion and discernment. You can recognize the wounds that drive others without excusing the harm those wounds may produce. You can understand unconscious patterns without becoming entangled in them. This balanced perspective often manifests as a quiet wisdom, a capacity to respond to life's complexities with nuance rather than reactivity. You may notice that you are less easily provoked by emotional turbulence. Situations that once overwhelmed you now appear as patterns rather than threats. You can observe conflict with an almost symbolic awareness, recognizing archetypal dynamics playing themselves out beneath the surface of individual personalities. You may see, for example, the frightened child hidden within an aggressive adult, the longing for recognition beneath defensive pride, the fear of abandonment beneath controlling behavior. These perceptions no longer destabilize you. Music, they deepen your understanding. And this understanding allows you to choose your responses consciously rather than reacting automatically. Perhaps the most profound shift at this stage is the transformation of your relationship to your own past. The trauma that once shaped your empathy no longer defines your identity. It becomes integrated into your psychological narrative as a source of insight rather than a source of limitation. You may look back upon your earlier experiences not with bitterness, but with a kind of sober recognition. You see how the psyche adapted, how it developed extraordinary perceptive abilities in order to survive conditions that required constant awareness. You recognize that the same sensitivity that once exposed you to overwhelming emotional currents also enabled you to navigate complex psychological environments with remarkable precision. And this realization produces a subtle but powerful form of reconciliation. You no longer view your past solely as something that wounded you. You begin to the rare completion of individuation see it as something that shaped you, something that through a long process of transformation contributed to the development of your psychological depth. This does not mean you romanticize